very funny. I was born in El Salvador, but because my father was paving the Pan American Highway. But since I was 4 years old, we moved to Guatemala, and I grew up in Guatemala. This is interesting. I also had a very religious upbringing by my mother's side. So I am Catholic, but it was very much the time of the Catholic grassroots communities and more the inculturation with local communities, indigenous communities, the commitment for the poor. And that was very, very important for my upbringing as well. And so there were figures that were very important, very relevant in general in Latin America. Many theologians like Gustavo Gutierrez or Leonardo Boff or some of these very progressive theologians. And then there were figures in Guatemala itself. I mean, there was a very famous poet, Otto René Castillo, who had been killed by the military, who was a poet. There were other personalities. One of my university professors with whom I studied law, labor law specifically, before there was human rights, was then subsequently assassinated by the military as well. So these became very relevant figures in the history of Guatemala. When I went into law school, for instance, I went with the idea of struggling for justice. This was my big idea. Very soon I discovered that not everyone that studies law necessarily wants, a big group of people want to make money, but not necessarily find justice. And I discovered that it was not always so easy, and that maybe I didn't want to spend all my time looking at just papers and doing legal stuff. So I was looking for human rights. We didn't have human rights as a profession then in Guatemala, so we began working on labor movements and labor law, which was the closest. I mean, it is part of human rights, but it was the closest we could get. And several of us that studied together, when we graduated, we began working with one of the big labor federations, the Central Nacional de Trabajadores, the CNT. And we were very young. I must have been 18, 19, no, a little bit more, 21 when I came on from the university. And we were moving along in these movements. And this, what used to be sort of ideals, very much in the theoretical sense, became very much a reality by sharing these struggles with these people. I mean, there was clearly injustice. They were being attacked and being confronted. And then we moved into the rural areas to try to teach Mayan indigenous communities on their constitutional rights and their rights. And then it just became worse and worse. For one, it taught me how to speak to people, because yes, I was Guatemalan, we all spoke Spanish, but when you move to the city, to the rural areas, I found there was a communication gap, a horrible community. They could not understand me. So it forced me to rethink my communication skills as well, and to begin adapting all the principles and the knowledge I had to a different language, to make me, to be able to be understood. And this is probably one of the biggest lessons in life, because I think this taught me to be able to speak to any public, whether it be a parliament in Europe, to a local indigenous community in Guatemala sitting around the fire and floor. So it gives you a different sense of communication and human being. So for me, this was probably one of the biggest lessons when I was very young, this trying to bring this knowledge. In those days, we grew up in a series of testimony. Like, for instance, people used to see that all of us who were young university graduates from the city, who were physically very different because we were all from European origin, were sitting there next to them in the strikes or the demonstrations in the street. And it was interesting because we used to go in jeans and dress. And one day I was asking a worker how he felt I should even dress. And he solved my problem. He said, look, the business sector brings in their lawyers, and their lawyers are all dressed up, and the judges pay attention to them. We want our lawyers to be as important as theirs and to look as good. So don't worry about it. So he immediately solved. It was a much more pragmatic perspective. Of course, in our daily life, we were sitting and doing it, we would dress as we casually, but when we had to go to court, we would dress as lawyers, because this is exactly what the workers wanted. They wanted good lawyers, presentable lawyers. So you kind of discover how pragmatic life was, but at the same time, how much of a bondage. I mean, I was picked up by the police in Guatemala many times in a strike with the workers. They would release me and they would not release the workers, but they could see that we were sharing. Those were the days when being a labor leader was risking your life. I mean, you didn't get any added benefit. I mean, you were really a vocation to serve your colleagues and your friends, and this was very important. And then in the rural areas it got worse. I mean, in the rural areas is when they began displacing the indigenous people from their land, usurping land, and this is when the protests grew, and when really the civil war got worse, and when they began the killings. And the more we raised our voices, the more people that were being killed, until our own federation was raided. The CNT, the Central Nacional de Trabajadores, was raided by the military in June of 1980 on a Saturday morning, and there were 37 leaders meeting, and they just took them all, and they disappeared. We never heard from them again. Just by chance, we were 9 members of the legal department, but that day none of us was there because they were having different meetings. So from then on, this was a night. Life became very difficult. Many of my colleagues were leaving into exile. I tried to stay as long as possible. We didn't have any headquarters anymore because it had been raided. So we would meet with the workers in the streets or in their factories, but at different times and locations, so as not to have a pattern of mobility. And then in 1981, I began to see my name on different lists. They were publishing lists of people that were going to be abducted. And it was very clear that my time was up. And they eventually came to my parents' home, which was my public address. I didn't live there. Two unknown individuals looking for me. And the message was very clear that it was time for me to leave because my time had come up. So
And your parents?
My parents were very shocked and very scared, but
they stayed.
They stayed, yes. My father by then was a retired man, and he'd been a construction man all his life and worked in construction. So there was really they had no relevance and no link to political life at all. As a matter of fact, I think it was a bit of a shock to have a son doing. I mean, they were very supportive, but it was still in a world difficult for them to understand in a way, especially for my father. My father was American, you see, that's because of the name. So he had come to Central America paving the Pan American Highway. He met my mother, they got married, and he stayed forever. And for him, this was all this craziness that was very complicated, and it was very, very difficult. We also used to work with the church, with the church grassroots communities in the rural areas. This was the time of theology of liberation and all these theologians, and that was also part of the work we were doing, working with very progressive priests. Several of my friends, the priests, were subsequently murdered later by the military. We had a group of peasants from the highlands of Quiche, from a town called Uspantan. They were planning to come to the city to protest because they were really suffering not only their lands being taken over, but many of their young leaders being disappeared. So they had decided to come to the city, and we had meetings with them, and we actually had one meeting with religious groups in support of them in a religious celebration. And one of these individuals, the leaders, was Vicente Menchú, the father of Rigoberta Menchú. Oh. And it was very interesting because this he said to us in a mass that we had, he says, we know as peasants, as Quiche Mayan people coming from the highlands, that we're running a big risk for being here in the city protesting. But he says, I think it's worth the risk because I've discovered that if I give a meaning to my death, I will automatically give a meaning to all my life. And he said this, and a week after is when they did the protest by taking over the embassy of Spain, and a peaceful sit-down they did in the embassy, which was raided by the police, and all of them were killed, in himself included, and the staff of the embassy, by the police of Guatemala. So this was the beginning of the most horrible period in history for us, because after the conquest, because this was in January of 1980. Then in June of 1980, we had when they broke into our headquarters at the labor movement, So it was just a sequence, first in January, the embassy, in June, the headquarters, and they just began killing people and kidnapping people. This was a very shocking period. It had all begun with one massacre called the Massacre of Panzos in the indigenous region, the Quechua region in the north, where they had killed 110 people. And it took 3 days for the news to get out to the city. But we were able, through the different church networks, to be able to launch this information out worldwide. Even though it was late, it was really very shocking information. This period was, and I left in 81 with the idea of trying to go back as soon as possible. In 82, we had the coup d'etat, which was the coup by General Rios Montt. And supposedly at the beginning they had announced that this was a coup of young officers to reform the country, when in reality it got worse. They moved from the individual killings and abductions and disappearances, they moved into mass killings. And this was the period of genocide that Guatemala went through in the 20th century. Between 82 and 83, 600 villages were destroyed and burned to the ground. So it was really a horrendous period. And in the meantime, I was always thinking of going back, and every day things got worse and got worse and got worse. So pretty soon, we all of us in exile recognized that we were not going to go back. So we went back a couple of times with international, because we were doing work at the UN. We're trying to denounce what was happening in Guatemala. We were working in the General Assembly in New York, and then in the Human Rights, what was then the Human Rights Commission, now the Council, in Geneva. And we went every year to both the Council and the General Assembly. And we got resolutions on Guatemala. So in one of those cases, one of the Guatemalan ambassadors said, because all these Guatemalans out here in exile are talking of a country they have not seen, the country has changed, nothing is happening, I invite them to go. So we all said, yes, we will take your invitation. So in 1988, we went back the first time, but with an international delegation. We had staff people from Congress in Washington, from Mexico, member of parliament from Britain, and many people internationally from Canada. Yes, very much to make sure that nothing happened. And we were still stopped by the police in the airport, and they faked that it was just a sort of a farce, but they had 200 policemen in the airport to give a show of force. But they let us stay a week in the country, and this was very important. And we went back. This was in May of 1988. Then we went back in August of 88, and then we went back in 89. It was interesting because in 1990, between 89, there was many student associations that had supported us and organized marches to receive us every time we went. Nothing happened to us because we had international accompaniment. But many of the student leaders, at least 12 of the student leaders, were subsequently abducted and disappeared and never appeared. Yes, they had been with us in 1989, in August of 89 actually, is when these abductions. I based myself in Washington originally because I thought that I needed to be in a place that would project the cases more, that I could speak out more. But also Washington has the Inter-American Human Rights Commission from the OAS. So what I had not been able to do in Guatemala, I studied human rights in Washington. So I began learning, and I studied about the Inter-American system and how to take cases there internationally to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And this was probably one of the best things. So we formed this association there with the idea of bringing strategic litigation on human rights against the state of Guatemala for all these horrendous atrocities that were happening and very few people knew. So we began filing cases at the Inter-American Court, Commission first and the court. And this was really one of the most important elements. So we would investigate a case, we would give advice to the victim. I went back, we formed this organization, the Center for Legal Action, in 1990 exactly. And I went back in 93, so after 3 years after we had formed this organization, because there was a coup d'etat. There was a president, Jorge Serrano, who decided that he wanted to be sort of a petty dictator and dissolve Congress and the Supreme Court and consolidated power. But this was a big mistake. He did it with the support of the right wing, of the hardliners in the military as well. But the whole question collapsed. Guatemala is a small country, and obviously the whole I mean, Latin America was moving into democratic rulers and away from dictators. So no one was going to accept sort of a petty coup like this to consolidate one more dictator. So a week after his coup, there was a general assembly, a special assembly of the OAS. All foreign ministers went, and all of them condemned, from the Americas, from Canada all the way to Chile. They all condemned the coup, isolated Guatemala, and the government collapsed. So this, for me, was the big opportunity to return alone for the first time without any international accompaniment. By then, my father had died in 1990. They did not allow me to go to his funeral to be with my mother. I mean, I could have gone, obviously legally, but I spoke to the embassy and I spoke to the government, and they said, no, if you come, we don't guarantee your security. But by 1993, with this coup that had failed and the hardliners in the military, they had lost this coup, I said, this is the chance. So I called my mother. She picked me up in the airport, and this is when I went back in 93. And from 93, I was living back in Guatemala. But by then, I was already known, very well known internationally. You see, I had been in New York, I had been at the UN, I had been in Geneva, I had spoken before Congress in Washington, I had spoken in Parliament in London, I had spoken to many parliamentarians around the world. So it was not so easy. So this time I changed this. Before, when I was younger, our idea was to be unnoticed and very private. This time my strategy was to be very visible, to show that I'm there, that I'm not hiding, and to make it known to the world as well. So I think this is one of the issues that saved me all along. I immediately did an interview with a friend who was a journalist in one of the big newspapers. I had a 2-page interview. I'm back, I'm here in Guatemala. So I was being very obvious so everyone could know that I was there and what I was doing. First, it would not arise any suspicion because I was very transparent of my position. But secondly, it would allow me to be able to carry out human rights and to speak out publicly, which is what I did. And yes, it was, but then began the peace process right after that, and the situation began to change because since 1990, the peace process had begun with the first agreement in the city of Oslo. So it was very important for us inside the country doing human rights to support the peace process and to demand the peace. It took 6 years, from 1990 to 96, to sign the final agreement. Let me here use a phrase of Boutros Ghali, who was the Secretary General of those days. Boutros Ghali made, I think, a very important contribution. He said, we have to make a difference between the peacemaking and the peace building. So the peacemaking is precisely the period of negotiation until you sign peace and effectively declare peace, demobilize those military forces that are in confrontation. And the peace building is what comes afterward to consolidate that peace process. I think we were very successful in the peacemaking. This process was a tremendous support from the international community. That's why I mentioned that the first meeting was carried out in Oslo in 1990. And during the first year, as a matter of fact, we had different meetings in different cities. We had in Oslo, in Metepec, Mexico, in Quito, Ecuador, in Atlisco, Mexico, in Querétaro, and several countries proposed different cities for the different parties to meet in different sectors of civil society. And then in 1992, something changes. We had negotiated the insurgent movement with the army, and the government had negotiated what's called the Global Agreement on Human Rights. Everyone agreed that human rights had to be the basis of the peace process. And the UN decided to establish a peacekeeping mission in Guatemala. This was a bit anomalous because normally they don't like to put a peacekeeping mission until the peace process has concluded, until final. And here it was very uncertain. In El Salvador, they had done it before, but only about 3 or 4 months before. But this was 92 in Guatemala, and they actually established a peace mission. It was MINUA, Misión de Naciones Unidas in Guatemala, which was there to verify only one agreement, the human rights agreement. So I think we also, it was very brave of United Nations to take this step and to actually play such a proactive role in the peace process. And having a permanent mission there, looking at human rights, made a big difference as well. also to allow the peace process to continue with the mediation of the UN, but also to protect those that were negotiating in different other social sectors. So yes, this was, and why I say we were very successful is because we had 10 agreements of different nature, including a socioeconomic agreement on refugees, on indigenous peoples, on human rights. So, and all of them in terms of substance were very good. We had a good amnesty law that did not allow amnesty for crimes against humanity or acts of violence against civilians. So it all really went, and this was a country that had just come out of genocide in the 80s, in 81, 82, 83. So to
very
reach,
fast process.
yes, to reach this was very important. But then where we have, I think, failed is in the follow-up, is in the peace building process. Because when you sign peace, you have to strengthen the state, the institutionality of the state. And even the government that signed peace was not interested in that. They were interested in making business and privatizing everything. They sold everything they had in the state. There was no interest in strengthening the justice system or anything else. And we did have a Truth Commission, which was very successful. We had a 3-member Truth Commission. One person was appointed by the Secretary General of the UN, and this was Professor Christian Tomusha from Germany, who played a very, very important role. Wonderful man. I had met him since the days he was rapporteur, and he was always absolutely professional. And then there was 2 Guatemalans, Alfredo Balcells, who was a very progressive social democratic lawyer, and Doña Otilia Lush, who is a Mayan leader expert, a woman expert on education. So I think the composition of the commission was very good, and they were very brave, they were very powerful, and they came out with great conclusions. But the document itself was so good that President Arzu, who had signed peace, did not even want to receive the report of the Truth Commission in 1999 when they presented it, because it said everything. It said, look, we looked at all the cases, and 93% of the cases appear to be responsibility of the military. 4% appear to be responsibility of the guerrillas, and 3% more of unknown actors. So of course the army and the right-wing sectors that supported the army did not like the report, but this was the truth. I mean, this was an army that had declared war on its own people. So I agree. I think establishing the truth is a fundamental element of a transition, but you must not only establish the truth, but you also must recognize the truth. And these are 2 different steps. Establishing the truth was done by the Truth Commission, but the recognition comes afterwards. And this is, if you look at the cases we have been battling, the case of a genocide case against Rios Montt, we had a decision by a first-degree court, the sentencing court we call, that declared there had been genocide and condemned Rios Montt. For the people that have suffered, for the victims, is not so much the question of whether Rios Montt, who is a very old man now, goes to prison or not, is the ethical question of whether justice is served, whether he can actually be condemned for a crime. Then he can fill the sentence in his home if he wants, because of age reasons and humanitarian reasons. But justice has to say that genocide existed and that he was responsible for that period of genocide. The first-degree court did it, but then the Constitutional Court reversed it for absurd little things, little details. So clearly the justice is not ready, and this is just recently, this is about four or 5 years ago. So the justice system is still not brave enough and not willing. We had very brave judges, especially the woman who was the head of court at the first-degree level of criminal court, but not in the Constitutional Court. This was the tragedy. And I think this is what we're suffering a little bit today. Yes, we have been able to acknowledge, to look at many cases to establish the truth. I eventually, besides working in Caldeache, I was also then invited by Vice President Stein to be part of the cabinet in 2004, and I was the Presidential Commissioner for Human Rights. And I put 2 conditions. I had not campaigned. I was not a member of any party. I had no interest in their parties. But I said, if you let me speak the truth and recognize the responsibility of the state in all the international cases. He said yes, and the president said yes, President Berger. And they fulfilled the promise. I was in charge of all the cases at the Inter-American system and at other international courts. And in every single case, we went to recognize the truth of the victims and to ask for forgiveness in the name of the state. But one of the most significant elements for me was the moral recognition activities we had in the rural areas. There was one lady who they had killed her husband in a very rural village in Sololá. And her husband had been assassinated leaving their little hut in the middle of their cornfield, their milpa. So when we said, yes, the state recognizes and the state will recognize the right to reparation and recognizes everything, we put a plaque in the municipal. She says, okay, I will accept the forgiveness of the state, but if the state comes and asks me for forgiveness in my own home. We said yes. This was a very beautiful thing because, of course, I never asked her where she lived. So when we discovered she was up in the highlands, and you had to walk down a ravine in the middle of corn. There was no road, no path, no nothing, and it was raining that day. So it was a very, very wet and muddy walk. But it was fantastic. I think the feeling of being able to go to this woman's house for her and her 4 children to be there and have the state come and say that the state was responsible and that they would ask for forgiveness. These are the elements that I can tell you hundreds of stories like that of recognition. There was another lady had her daughter abducted. And in the rural areas, indigenous communities keep a very close relationship with their deceased. They go to the cemeteries, they have celebrations in the cemetery, they take bread and water and for certain holidays. And she was always very painful for her that she did not have a tomb to do this for her daughter. So we said, would you like to have a tomb for your daughter, even if she's disappeared? And she said, yes, very much. So we asked her for the photograph, and we had a sculptor make a bust of her daughter from the photo. So we actually built in the cemetery a tomb with the bust of her daughter on top. And when we opened it and we took the covers off, this woman had organized a celebration with the entire village because now she could also go to the cemetery with everyone else to celebrate with their deceased. This was incredibly important within their tradition. This is what I talk about acknowledgement. Now, these were individual acts of acknowledgement, but I'm sorry to say that I don't think this is the attitude of the state of Guatemala yet. I mean, the state of Guatemala still, in a way, allowed me to recognize responsibility in individual cases, but the attitude of the elite of Guatemala, I know the military is still an attitude of denial. They're still, oh, this didn't happen, let's forget the past, let's not talk about the past, let's ignore the past. And I keep on saying you can't move to a different chapter, you can't build a different era if you don't close the one before, if you don't give closure to a certain period. And this is probably one of the most important lessons. I think the difference between knowledge and acknowledgement. I said we have to have the truth and the knowledge, but we also need acknowledgement by the state and by the authorities of what they did, what went wrong, and the fact that it has never to be done again. And I think the acknowledgement, and I would agree with the principle, that the acknowledge has to have both elements. The authority, those that were responsible have to acknowledge that they did it and why, but there also have to be an acknowledgement of dignity of the victims. They were people struggling to change the situation. This is what I was mentioning was this lady that demanded that the state go to her house because they killed her husband there as she was leaving.
In the house?
In front of, it was actually outside, but he was walking out. This was a green area, and they were hiding in the corn, the men that shot him. So I think it was very important for her in this very remote little village up in the mountains that the state not just make some document or symbolic act of acknowledgement, is that they go to the place where they committed the crime in front of her and acknowledge in front of her what they had done. I think this was the dignity of her husband being recuperated. This was very, very important. With the students that were abducted, I had to do also an activity at the university. We decided to do it at the university. It was interesting because we asked a sculptor to think of design something. And he designed a series of tablets with the shape of the desk of a student. You know, you have your you're like this, the tablet where you write. So he did the 12 tablets like desks, and in a garden in the university campus, because he said these were students and they have to be recognized as students and leaders. So we're acknowledging their identity, we're acknowledging that they were killed, but we were also acknowledging that they were student leaders, what they were doing at the time, and in the university, you know. So these are, I think people miss the point. Some of these things are, of course, symbolic, all of them. And some people think that because they're symbolic, they're less important. They're not. They are very important because they go deep into the feelings of an individual, but also of a nation. You have to create the mentality of a nation of reconciliation, and to have the reconciliation, you have to have the acknowledgement. And then you can move on. I always say that the peoples of a nation that does not have a full right to recognize their past will never be totally free to design their future. I think reconciliation is a form of national building, yes. And I think this is very important. I think one of the elements that we have missed, and this is one of the elements of violence today, is the question of identity. Nations are defined by their identity. And identity is defined by the triumphant periods, yes, but it's also defined by its tragedies and its horrible periods. And you have to acknowledge both to be able to have a true identity as a nation. Because you see, the new nationalism is based on marking differences. It's not based necessarily on acknowledging the identity, because when you acknowledge identity, you're acknowledging the history and the values of a nation. People, each society has a history. Parts of it is good, part of it is bad. But out of that, they develop certain values and certain ethics. And this is what makes them what they are. But of course, this can be distorted, which is what some people do. They want to mark the differences and not the values. What was the difference between the Hutus and the Tutsis really in Rwanda? Not very much, almost nothing. So those that exacerbated the differences and used this sort of national identity to build violence was a sort of disinformation of what a real identity is. I think identity is peace building, because we have a diverse world and we recognize our diversity and the richness of our different values and the understanding. But yes, if you are a right-wing movement that wants to define your racial superiority and out of that your domination of the world, yes, but this is not identity. This is disinformation. This is mobilizing the wrong feelings. I always thought that history always moves forward, and especially on human rights, my feeling is that we always move ahead, sometimes very slowly, but we always move ahead, and we cannot backtrack. And this is not entirely true. I don't think we're necessarily going backwards. I think history, yes, always moves forward. But I have discovered that history is a little bit like quantum physics. It doesn't move in a straight line, it moves in waves, like energy. And sometimes wave is going up, and sometimes it's going low. I don't think we can go back. I would hope to believe that. At least I would hope to believe that we can never go back. Which is even worse, because sometimes when you look at some things that are being done today, and the racism, the xenophobia, the incitement to violence, which could lead to genocide again in some places, looks like a setback. And I think what it is a very cynical position, because people already know what that generates, already know what that can cause. But I think we're going through a very low slump in this sort of waves. And it has shocked me. I mean, there are things happening, political leaders around the world that say things that I never thought that we could see openly said by a political leader. And this is coming from many parts of the world, which are astonishing. I mean, and I think are a very bad symptom of our times. Those of us that are human rights activists begin to see ourselves like a minority again. I feel as if I were in Guatemala of the old days when you were scared to talk about human rights, because everyone. Let me tell you a secret, which is not going to be a secret after we say it on camera, but in UNESCO here, people tells me, I have delegations telling me, no, you're too much of a human rights activist. Human rights is for Geneva. Leave human rights for Geneva, but Paris, no. No. This is UNESCO, you should talk only about education. I think this is inconceivable. UNESCO was the first institution to talk about human rights before the UN was established, 2 years before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. UNESCO was established in 46 and the Universal Declaration was in 48. Was the first institution to talk about freedom of expression and the free flow of ideas and knowledge. You cannot separate an institution like UNESCO from free expression and human rights. But there's people here, and this is serious people that I hear these things and it shocks me, it scares me. I think it is a fear. I think people, talking about human rights is like this very tense moment. I'm living through moments of tension every time we talk about freedom of the press, journalism. I think one is that one learns in life that maybe the most important value. Yes, you have to be brave, but oftentimes as important as being brave is to be consistent. Because I find many leaders around the world have not been that consistent. I think that if you have struggled for human rights when you were young, you will continue doing it all your life. And also when you felt uncomfortable raising your voice because it would put you in danger or in an uncomfortable position, life makes us, as we grow older, look for comfortable positions again. And I think that's fine. I have nothing against trying to have a peaceful and comfortable life, but I think we must never allow that to make us silent. We must never allow comfort to silence our ideals. We should always be young at heart and maintain the ideals as strong as always. And this is the consistency. And I think eventually this will make us happier too, because we will feel the energy of our life and what we're doing. There's several special people that I have a deep admiration. Some are public figures and some are not. Public figures, one of my biggest sort of ideals was always to meet, and I never had a chance to meet Nelson Mandela, for instance. I think this was the man who, and similar to him, by the way, just to mention the other example, is President Mujica, Pepe Mujica from Uruguay. These are men that struggle all their life and even went through armed struggle in some periods for justice and liberation of their peoples, and eventually became to be recognized statesmen and came to the most powerful post in their country. But they never allowed that to swallow them. They were always themselves. Mandela was always Mandela, and he always would keep his principles and his priority. He said it very clearly, I am the president of all South Africa. I am to serve everyone, even those that I confronted before. And he also said, I'm going to be here one period. I don't have the need to be more. And he committed himself to that. And Mujica was exactly the same. So I think that in a way you have people that even if they have reached the epitome of power, they never lost their priorities and their principles and the sense of service. And then I have many examples in my own country of less known people. My son, my second son is called Mario because he was exactly born on the day they killed one of my strongest colleagues in the labor movement, Mario, when my son was born many years ago, and 30-some years ago. And for me, this was the same. Mario Mujia was the symbol of this man who was an intellectual but living in the northwest province of Guatemala, where Huehuetenango, giving his life for others. And equally, I had a very bright woman who had been the head of personnel of big corporations, and she was a mid-age sort of wife with 2 children, and left her comfortable position, went back to law school, studied law, to become the defender of many people, beginning with the workers. And she tragically was disappeared by the military. But these were wonderful people who are real symbols in my life, of people that I met that were very close to me and that were all their life dedicated to what they had decided to do. And many of them had changed, like her, Yolanda Aguilar, Yolanda Uriza was her name, had changed in midlife because they decided to engage in a life working for human rights and giving their effort for others. I work in education, but from a different perspective. I'm the Assistant Director General for Communication and Information, which is an area. It's interesting because it's not the press department of we have a very good press department in UNESCO, but communication and information is an area less known. People know UNESCO for education. But this is the area of communication where we build education through ICT, through internet technology, education at a distance, how to build access to information, how to build knowledge societies, how to build freedom of expression, and how to have a free press. This is the area. And for me, as you may know, I was rapporteur of freedom of expression before of the Human Rights Council. And for a long time, doing human rights, because I am a lawyer, but also a journalist, I did radio. And I'm a visually impaired person, so I worked on issues of people with handicap, but also on communication, because especially through radio. And for me, communication is an essential element of building peace, of having the more dialogue system of education, of building a better understanding between societies and nations, of building knowledge societies, of having development. The new agenda that we have all accepted, the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, the goal 16 is a wonderful goal, and I think it was an afterthought of all the states that were meeting, but very important, because goal 16, they say, what are the conditions for development in the world? In the world, you need to have societies that are in peace, that are inclusive, with no discrimination of any kind, that guarantee access to justice for everyone, that are transparent in all what they do, and that guarantee public access to information. Because public access to information means to public information, to what the state does, what state authorities, but also means to guarantee a free press. I always say having public access to information is the first element of participation. This year we had an interesting celebration. We had this past year, in 2016, we had the Freedom of the Press Day was celebrated in Helsinki. And it was in commemoration of the oldest law in the world of freedom of expression and access to public information. And the initiative came from a young scientist who was really a biologist, but who was also a philosopher and thinker of those days, Peter Forsskål. And he decided to distribute a pamphlet on issues that were essential for civil rights. This was in 1752, many years ago, and 250 years ago exactly. And it was very interesting because Peter Forsskål said in one of his paragraphs says, in order to seek the common good, we need to guarantee the effort of all, meaning all have to participate, exactly what you're saying. Everyone has to. And in order to guarantee the participation of all, we have to guarantee that everyone has the relevant information and can discuss it and can openly debate. So for him, it was all in context. We're looking for the common good. We should all do it, but we should do it in the context of being well informed and having the possibility of debating public policies and also accessing public information. We have to know what the state knows. Everyone should know. So I think this was, it actually got drafted into a law in 1766, even before the Declaration of Independence of the U.S. and certainly before the Constitution, the First Amendment. So it was very interesting because 250 years of this law, which was then Sweden and Finland together. Of course, the law only lasted 10 years, and then King Gustav decided to go back to authoritarianism and took the law away. But it was interesting that a philosopher of those days wanted to guarantee public participation of all, by also guaranteeing freedom of expression and access to information. I think there is economic gap, yes, and not only of nations, developing nations, but also within every nation, of urban societies and rural societies. But I also should add, and this I say with deep pain, there's a gender gap as well. Because in societies, we're still relegating women in many places of the world to a second place for scientific knowledge, for developing this. And this we know because we have done some research, and this for us is one of the priorities. We have to guarantee connectivity. Everyone talks about connectivity of the next billion, but we say yes, but with certain social criteria. We don't want just connectivity to increase the business of the big platforms. We want more connectivity to make sure that the rural areas are connected. Maybe not in an individual way, maybe not in every household, but it could be in a collective way, in libraries or in internet centers. The important element is that people receive the access to an internet and the right information. So we also connect connectivity with the necessary information that liberates, that is education, that is science, that is gender sensitive, that can actually produce results. And this is important because oftentimes people just think about the technical part of connectivity. That's not enough. We have to engage in the human side of connectivity and internet. We also have to engage in the dangers, by the way, and have a prevention policy with children and young people in terms of the dangers that also internet can have. I think that an interactive database of people that have given their testimony and oftentimes their lives for the world is probably the most important database that we can have. If we don't learn from our valiant people, those that were willing to give it all, then we will never learn from anything. I profoundly feel this is a very important database.